beginning of the dream, if you like. That was quite a long time ago now, actually. I remember I was just walking down, I think it was Basingstoke Canal, and I saw a narrowboat, and it was just one of those moments where you kind of like, ooh, I quite like the look of that. That looks like that might be quite a cool thing to do. I guess then that idea, nothing really happened after that. That was just, but some seed was planted in the back of my mind then. And then I got to a point in my life where I think I definitely started to feel like I wanted a change. And it just happened to coincide with my granddad. Like a lot of old people, he has some money and he wanted to pass it on, but he didn't really want to wait until he was dead. So he basically gave me, my brother and my sister our inheritance early. Now, I looked into getting a house, but it wasn't quite enough, really, because everybody knows how difficult it is to get on the housing ladder nowadays. But then I guess that seed that had been there from the narrowboat started to turn into like a slight bud, and I thought, wow, what about a narrowboat? And I went and looked at some. I sort of did some initial research. Initially, I almost just bought one outright, and the guy was, I would refer to him as a bit of a used car salesman, but for narrowboats. He was a little bit pushy. We ended up getting a survey done on the narrowboat. It was one of those things where it was too much of a good deal. It was a 72-foot narrowboat, and it was only 22 grand, which for any boaters out there knows is like pretty cheap. And he was selling it as a sail away, even though it wasn't a brand new boat. It was an old boat that had been gutted, basically. And we got the survey done, and it basically turned out it was cut and shut, to use a motoring term. It was two boats put together. And you can, once I'd known that, I could see the line where they were welded together. Now, that's not necessarily a deal breaker, but I was a bit concerned that he hadn't mentioned that. And then he started to get really defensive when I asked him why he hadn't mentioned that. And then I found some more rust on it, and I just left it. And that was where the quick route to narrowboat kind of died there. And I thought, I got a bit freaked, because I was like, wow, I almost did that, and what if I'd have wasted my money on a heap? And so then I started the idea of basically getting what's called a proper sail away, which is where I went to a company and they built the shell of the boat for me, and they insulated it, and it has an engine in it, and it's like watertight, it has windows, but effectively that's it. It's just a long yellow corridor, and then I was going to do the rest. Which makes it sound like really confident, oh yeah, because you've built narrowboats before, right, Bones? Nope, I hadn't even really done DIY or anything, and it was pretty crazy. I just spent probably a year and a half, getting on to 2 years. There was a bit of overlap with learning, doing loads of research, deciding on the things that I wanted on a boat, decided on the things I didn't want on my boat, doing a couple of evening classes, I did a woodwork evening class, I did a plumbing evening class and an electrics evening class. And that kind of gave me an initial thing, but most of what I learned, YouTube. Watched so many YouTube videos of people that were fitting out their narrowboats, and then just got the narrowboat, put it into a marina. In a sense, the rest is history, because then I built the narrowboat in the marina, and then that was 2019. So I've actually been living on it, I'd say a year and a half, getting near a year and a half. So on the actual canals and rivers. But before that, I lived on it in the marina. As an aesthetic, as you can kind of see, my aesthetic idea was haunted ship meets old pub, this dark wood idea. And this is actually wood stain. It's actually the kind of stain that you use on decking and stuff in the garden. And then I had the copper and the brass and that sort of this very oldie worldy feel that I wanted to go for. How much it cost? Right. Well, the most expensive thing was the hull. I made a point of trying to save money where I could, but not scrimp. Things that were worth spending money on, I spent money on things like batteries. I got lithium batteries, and my solar panels, they're quite expensive solar panels, so I didn't scrimp on those because I knew I needed to rely on them. But the wood, I basically begged, stealed and borrowed everything from pallets to old scaffolding boards, wood that people were throwing away, and once it was stained, it just all looked the same. Didn't matter. I'd say 80% of the wood on this boat, maybe even near 90, is free. So, all this wood you see around you, it's free. All I had to do was stain it. Boaters are always uncomfortable telling you the final total, but let's just say it was around 45k. Around that. A lot of that was money that after I'd got the inheritance and bought the shell, then I'd already been saving for a few years, and then basically any extra money I had just went straight into the boat. I didn't have a lot of fun in those 2 years, if you know what I mean. But since then, I've had it valued and it's worth 70 to 80k. But I'd like to point out that I didn't actually do it for an investment. And people do like to talk about the money side of it quite a lot. And actually, it's probably the least important side to me. Living on a narrowboat is off-grid by its nature, and even more so here. I mean, if you live in a marina, you can have hookup and stuff like that, and sometimes showers, and sometimes even like washing machines and stuff. So living in a marina is a very different experience. And when I lived in a marina, and I thought, oh, this is a bit tougher. Then I went from living in a marina to living on the actual canals and rivers, and I'm like, whoa, the marina was much easier. So it's all degrees really of convenience and things like that. As you can probably see around the boat is lots of wood, because one of my main heating sources is my stove, and I also cook on my stove. And I have like a little emergency gas thing, like a camping stove, but I don't have gas plumbed in as such. Everything is kind of, what you start to realise on a narrowboat is that your resources are finite. So I have a water tank, and whatever's in that water tank is what I've got for, everything. It's not like mains water. I've got to be careful I don't ever leave a tap running. I'm always trying to sort of be conscious of water, which I think has actually been really good for me. Like, I think I was too complacent about resources when I lived in the flat, and now I'm like very aware of my consumption, and you just can't take anything for granted. You've got to be like, have I got enough water to last this week? Like, for example, the weather forecast for this week is that we might have snow. And so I know it's going to be more difficult to leave the boat, and I need more wood. The water pipes, like where I get my water from, they get turned off so they don't get frozen, so I won't be able to collect water for a week. The worst you think of if you live in a flat, if there's going to be snow or whatever, is like, have I got a sledge? It's just, it's a different thing really. Living off grid, you have to be more responsible, I think, in a way. That's not to say people that live in flats are irresponsible, but I'm saying responsible for your use of resources. Because I invested quite a lot of money in my electric system, spent quite a lot of time on it, it kind of runs itself. I initially tried to do a cheaper version, which turned out that I was having to check it all the time. And so that's a point where I spent more money so that I didn't have to worry about it as much, I think. I think living on a narrowboat can't help but give you a different perspective, because you are right in the centre of nature. Like, I look out of one of my portholes and there's a field, and look out my other my portholes and it's a river. So I'm literally in this liminal space between these two things. I have always loved nature. I've always been very outdoors. I was like a scout. Me and my brother used to do these like big hikes we called mega walks, basically hang out in forests and stuff. And I think if somebody used to ask me where my favourite place to be is, it's to be in a forest walking. Outdoors has always been something that I've loved, and you just feel closer to it on a narrowboat. It's just beyond there, and you can hear it a lot of the time. There's an awareness that you have of the nature around you. Interestingly, my values haven't changed. It's tapping into something that's always lived in me. I'm now right next to it. I don't have to go very far to be in nature. And actually, when I have spent a few days like in a row on the boat, like pop into Reading town or whatever, it's like, I'm like, God, it's really noisy. There's a lot of pollution, and so many people. I've lived in Reading town. I never thought that when I lived there. So that is a shift. The peace that you get on the river is something that I don't take for granted at all now, I think. So I think something about narrowboating as well is that there's a romanticism attached to it, especially when people first come on my boat. They're like, oh wow, this is amazing, I want a narrowboat. And I'm like, yeah, it's cool. But there are a lot of things that you don't necessarily think of, and I have had to adapt, I think is the way of it. Like, I have to park my van quite far away. So every day, if I was to go to my van every day, it's half an hour walk to my van and a half an hour walk back. Now, that's not much. But when there's lots of snow, when it's really cold, when it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you're just coming back from tour, sometimes those things get a little bit old. I'm always carrying lots of bags of everything backwards and forwards, heavy bags, because I just try and make that journey as few times as possible. Sometimes in the summer I do it in the canoe because that's a little bit easier. You can't live in the middle of nowhere and have all the benefits of that without living in the middle of nowhere and having the negative aspects to that, which is that you're usually far away from modernity. Now, luckily, there's a community around here of people, so I can reach into that for help if I need it, and we all help each other out as boaters, which is really nice. And that helps to nullify some of the negative aspects of it, especially to do with isolation, which is something which I just never thought about, because I was so into like the idea of building this boat and all of the sort of the adventures I'd have on it, that obviously there are times, especially during the winter, and especially if like the river is what they call red boards, which means you can't go anywhere, you're stuck. And you're stuck in the middle of nowhere, and you're stuck by yourself. That has been something which has required some adaptation, and something which I didn't give enough gravity to, I think, when I first thought about having a narrowboat. Being a musician and living on a narrowboat, in some ways they're perfectly matched. I have this kind of sporadic income. The way I live on a narrowboat, this is not necessarily the same for everybody else, but is lower cost way of living, and so it suits that lifestyle a little bit better. You know, you just sort of, you're sitting there, you sit in front of the fire, you just grab your guitar, play a little song. Being in this confined space has its positives and negatives. The negatives are that, you know, it's small and you can't have a lot of possessions, but also it means that there's not necessarily a lot of clutter, so that kind of gives you room to think, gives you room to create. And actually, interestingly, the name of my boat, Crucible, is about alchemy, the mixing of ideas, and to me, that's why I named my boat Crucible. It continues to be a place where I create and I blend ideas together, and I create songs, and sometimes even record songs on here as well. So, I mean, people look at me and kind of go, yeah, okay, yeah, you live in a narrowboat. So when I say it, they instantly put the two things together and they go, big beard, narrowboat, yeah, that makes complete sense. People are a lot more interested, I think, and they want to know all about it. Probably might even know somebody that lives on a boat. A lot of people will have their narrowboat story. It can be positive or negative. It can be, oh, I had a friend that lived on a narrowboat and they couldn't stand the toilet, so they left. Cool, thanks for that. The idea of narrowboating and the reality of narrowboating are two very different things. The reality is that you are adopting a different way of life, and if you try to carry through all of your old behaviours and all of your old thought patterns into a narrowboat and try to make your narrowboat exactly the same, I'd ask why you're bothering. Why don't you just stay in bricks and mortar? If you want a narrowboat to be exactly the same, it's not. You know, it's always going to be different. But I would say also that part of what makes it interesting at times is its differences. Yes, there are challenges. Yes, there are times when there are things you have to do to maintain the boat that you wouldn't necessarily have to do in a flat or a house, that you're just like, oh God, do I have to really go and get water again? Or, you know, if it's really cold and you have to put the fire on again, you know, at some point you make that decision, you're like, is this worth it? There are plenty of times when I felt like giving up, so I completely understand why it wouldn't be for everybody. When I go around and visit people that live in houses and they just flush the toilet, and I'm like, wow. Like, for example, like when I do my washing, I have to do it at that laundrette, and that's like a 40-minute walk that way with a massive backpack on, whereas people just walk through into their kitchen and put their washing in the washing machine. And certain everyday things are more complex. You kind of can accept that, and that's part of it. And yes, of course, you get narrowboaters that have all the mod cons and they're massive narrowboat, and some narrowboats you can walk onto and it's like a luxury flat. But, you know, this is not a luxury flat. The sort of things that I would change if I was to do my narrowboat again, because you learn, and it's been a whole over 2-year process of building a narrowboat. When I bought my stove, I had the option of getting a back boiler, which is a way of creating hot water when the stove's on. Didn't get that because I thought I'd have other means of making hot water, and I do. I have a diesel heater and I have the engine, but what I've since learned is that the thing I have on the most is the stove. So if that whole time I was creating hot water, then I could be saving diesel. I would always have hot water, and I didn't have to turn an extra device on just to get hot water. I remember when they told me about the size of the water tank, like I literally had no idea how big a water tank should be. So they were like, oh yeah, it's like 300-400 litres. And I'm like, wow, it's amazing. Yeah, cool, cheers. And that's so not enough. Like people on narrowboats have like 1,000-litre tanks. So I would get a much bigger water tank, and there's actually room for it. So I could have got a bigger one. I ended up getting a sort of an auxiliary one, but still I would get as big a water tank as you possibly can. That's what I would say to anybody else. As much as I love the decor, there are some moments, like since I initially built it, where I started to add splashes of colour, and I think I would probably do more of that, and I may even do more of that in the future. I may just play around with it not being all completely so uniform. Still a lot of it is going to be dark wood. I may play around with some other colours and that. They'll all be warm tones, but yeah, definitely. I think there are quite a lot of boaters that are actually single or living on a boat by themselves. There are couples as well, obviously. I think those couples would probably struggle with the fact you are in a very small space. By definition, it's hard to sort of get away from each other. You're with each other 24/7. It's not really like a house going into a separate room, because on a narrow boat you're still very close to each other and you can hear each other further down. Yeah, it's not ideal. Something I never thought would happen living on a narrowboat was actually when I started my YouTube channel. That kind of started as a joke, really, I'll be honest with you. I'd started this social media stuff just with the pictures, but it was just photographs. It wasn't any video or anything like that. And then a lot of my friends were like, yeah, you should so start a channel. And I was just like, oh, I don't really know if anybody would care. And then so I sort of started it from friends sort of prodding me a little bit. And yeah, it's like definitely taken off, and actually it's been really nice actually to share everything with a much wider audience. And my background before I became a musician was actually in making films, as it were. And in fact, at a certain point in my life, I was going to be a video editor. That was my sort of teenage career dream, if that makes sense. And I did various courses in that and trained in editing, and then life gets in the way and I ended up teaching more editing than I am actually doing it, and it kind of took the shine off it a little bit, and I got to the point where I wasn't really enjoying it anymore. And that's when I decided to redirect and take the music in my life a lot more seriously and become a touring musician, etc. But obviously you never forget how to edit, you know. Yes, technology changes, but the principles behind making films never really changes. The language of film will always be the same. It's something that I hadn't tapped back into for many years, and then this YouTube channel has allowed me to sort of go back to these things that I did, you know, quite a few years back, and regain my love for making videos again. I think really grateful for that. And you know, I get people from all over the world commenting on my videos, and they get something out of it, and all I'm really doing is sharing my thoughts and my day with them, and that's really nice. I really like that. What do I want to be doing in 10 years' time? You have dreams, don't you? And I think that I've made myself a home. So there are things there that I've never done before in my life. For the first time in my life, I created a space that was my own, and it was the way I wanted it to be. Up until then, I'd always lived in rented accommodation. I could do very little to change my environment. In some ways, one of the biggest lessons from making a boat was the fact that I can do that. I can create a space that I want to live in. And interestingly, that's kind of made me want to do it again a little bit. So years ago, I used to have a camper van, and I ended up having to get rid of that. I have considered converting my touring van that I have with my band into a camper van at some point, maybe. And I've also thought about would I ever buy a rundown old cottage or something and renovate it? And these are all just seeds of dreams. But then that's where the boat started. And you know, don't ask me for details. I don't know anything about that. I don't know how I would afford that. I don't know anything like that. But that's not what dreams are about. Dreams aren't about being practical and pragmatic about it. That will come eventually. Right now, they're just ideas, because I'm happy right now living on the boat. But, you know, when you start to talk about 10 years in the future, how do you know how you're going to feel? And I know that those dreams are dreams I have now, and they could be possible things that could happen in the future. So there you go.